chapter 2, starting in verse 46, it says, "Then the king Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and worshipped Daniel and commanded that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors unto him. And the king answered unto Daniel and said, Of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldest reveal this secret." Turn over to chapter 3, verse 26, if you would. Starting in verse 26, it says, "Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God, come forth and come hither. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth of the midst of the fire, and the princes and governors and captains and the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men, upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was an hair of their heads singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who had sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word and yielded their bodies that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. And then one more, chapter 4, verse 37. Verse 37, it says, Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth, and his ways judgment, and those that walk in pride he is able to abase. Be seated. We could have gone on with the verses that we read. Obviously, we started off differently than we normally would. Typically we read a portion of a chapter and then pray and sit. And today we jumped all around in a few different chapters. As we go through the message tonight, really we're going to jump around quite a bit through the book of Daniel. In reading to start off, here's what I want us to try and see, and we'll see if you guys grasp what I wanted you to. That in every encounter, Daniel and his companions, and I have it written companions because you should try typing Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. My iPad won't let me do it. It changes them all over. So if I say companions, it means those three. Every encounter that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had, people turned to God. All three of those places that we looked at are situations that they're in, specifically with the king, and in all three of those, it was the king turning to God. For the most part, again, it's the king that we see in the book of Daniel. Some turning from idolatry to God. They were worshiping idols, even forcing others to worship the idol that they had set up. But when these men were used of God, the king turned from his idolatry to God. Some from false gods. Fall came through for Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The king realized that his God was dead and turned to God. Some of the scenarios we see in the book of Daniel, we have people turning from, I just have it worded, self-worship. That's what's happening when King Darius sets up that no one can pray or make petition to anyone other than himself. It's making it so that no one is above him, that all the focus has to be on him. And self-worship, as I was studying this, is something that I believe is more common today than it ever has been. There are less people, it seems at least, there are less people that are falling for and following false idols, and less falling for and following false religions, and more following after the God of self. Putting themselves and what they want over all else. So what's happening, when you get the first sunny Sunday in a long stretch and suddenly a pile of people can't make it to church because they need, quote, family time. In reality, what they want is to get out in the sun. They are serving the God of self. But when Daniel comes around, Darius turns from the God of self, and by the end of chapter 6, he's saying that he fears God and that God is the living God. Every time that we see these men, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, every time we see them, we see people turning from their sin, from their idolatry, from their false religions, from self, and to God. And I want to present this night, as we're in our missions month, that's missions. Yeah. That's missions. And for myself, the title I have for tonight's message is Missions by Daniel. 2 Sundays ago, I preached that missions starts with you. Here's the idea here that and I said this when I preached that message, that missions isn't always translated to going somewhere. When I preached it, I said it doesn't always mean a foreign field or a church plant somewhere. But I'll say this also, it also doesn't mean just when you go out soul winning. You look at these encounters for Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these aren't their regular planned visitation times. This is not Daniel's, I'm going to go out door knocking today time. Here is what it is. Everywhere he went, he showed people Christ. That's missions. It's exactly what you and I ought to be doing. It doesn't matter if we're going door knocking, if we're going to work, the grocery store, or the park. Those around us should be hearing about Christ. I got to do this a few weeks ago. I like to call them random witnessing moments when it just, you're not planning it and it just happens. I had gone to the park with the kids and the dog. We actually had a break in the rain for like a half an hour, so we loaded up and ran to the park. And showing up at a park with kids and a dog is a great way to meet and talk to people. It just works. And the park that we went to has a pond at it, so when we take the dog there, I always throw a training dummy out in the pond so she can dive out and go swimming for it and all that. And every time I do, people stop to watch. And one particular guy, this last time, stopped and watched the dog for a little bit. And then when he came up to talk, he noticed I was wearing an OSU Beavers hat. And he was a Beaver alum, so it instantly started a conversation. And long and the short of it is, in the conversation, I was able to give him the plan of salvation. That is missions. Yep. Right. Showing people Christ wherever you are. Not just when you're planning to, but wherever you are. That's exactly what we're seeing with Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Everywhere they go, we see people turning to Christ. Here's what I want us to look at tonight. These four men did missions in three different ways that we can see in these passages. I want to look at those three. They showed people Christ, if you will, in three different ways. Number one, they showed people Christ through their words. Both directly and indirectly. Their words directly pointed to Christ through things like interpreting dreams. Daniel chapter 2 verses, I'll just look at two verses. First one is verse 37. It says, "Thou, O king, art..." Yeah, okay, I thought it was in the wrong chapter. "Thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory." Skip down to verse 44. "And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all of these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever." Notice all that he said was about God. I didn't have us turn to the other passages where he interprets dreams and visions, but they all point to God. Daniel, in everything he said, directly points to God. Directly points to God in things like a tribulation. If you were to look at Daniel chapter 3, verse 16 through 18, it says, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known of thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image thou hast set up." Now think of this situation for a moment. They've been set up. Now the king is mad and wants them dead. The fiery furnace is right there. The king is saying, "You're going to die. What's your response?" In essence saying, "Do you have any last words?" And their last words are in short, this: "We're not afraid because God." They could have begged for their lives. They could have pleaded that the king have mercy on them, and probably no one would have thought any less of them. But instead, in the face of certain death, their response is to tell the king about God. Their response is, God can handle this. Their words, everything they said, directly pointed to God. Which really can get a person to thinking. How often do you intentionally bring the focus to God? How often do you, in conversation, bring the focus to God? It doesn't even have to be in some weird, awkward way. I think often that's our concern, that if I'm always bringing up Christ in conversation, people are going to think I'm some weirdo. You know, I'm some kind of crazy Christian or something like that, and I've just come to the conclusion that's fine with me. There are definitely worse things to be known by than being a follower of God. But I get not wanting people to think, that you're some sort of weirdo. But it doesn't always, bringing up God doesn't always have to be an awkward way.
Yeah.
A while back I was talking to a friend, and he was telling me he's claims to be Christian but doesn't live it at all. But I was talking to him, and he was telling me about something good that had happened for him. And he's going on about how great this was, and my response was simply this: that's awesome, thank the Lord.
Yeah.
And he stopped and said, what'd you say? I said, that's awesome, thank the Lord. And he goes, oh yeah, I guess I should. It's bringing the focus to God in a way that isn't super awkward. These men directly through their words brought the focus to God, but they also did it, saying it this way, indirectly. Think of the beginning of the book of Daniel. I'm not going to have us turn there right now, but when they're taken as young men, and Daniel purposes in his heart not to defile himself with the portion of the king's meat. You'll notice nowhere in there he doesn't insult the king's meat. He doesn't say it's vile and wicked and I won't touch it. He doesn't even, in that section, he doesn't even mention God. He doesn't even say, I can't eat this because God told me not to. But indirectly, he's showing the prince of the eunuchs his God. Here's what he's doing. Daniel is setting a precedence. He was showing right off the bat, as soon as he's taken captive, he's showing right off the bat that he's going to trust God, not men, and he's showing that right off the bat, he'll fear God rather than the king. Chapter 1, he sets a precedence for how he's going to live and what we're going to see through the entire book. And whether directly or indirectly, the words that these men spake, all four of them, brought men to God. We see it in all of these examples that the end result is the king the king saying that they serve the true and living God. They showed people Christ. Show people Christ first through their words. They show people Christ secondly through their actions. This is an old saying, but it still holds true that what you do speaks louder than what you say. There are a lot of people that can go out and speak the right words, that know what they ought to say, but have no desire to live it at all. But you can talk right all that you want to, and if people see you living something else, your words aren't worth anything. You can say it all you want, but if what they see you doing is something different, then your words are just wasted breath. But often that's true in our Christian life, that we say the right things, we tell people the right things, but then what we're actually doing is a whole lot different, and they see that and say, well, then why do I have to do what you're saying? But these men didn't just know the right words to say, they lived it. They served God despite king's decrees. If you were to turn over to chapter 3, verse 4 through 6, it says, "Then an herald cried out to you, 'It is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth that shall the same hour be cast in the midst of a burning fiery furnace.'" Skip down to verse 12. "There are certain Jews whom thou set over affairs of the provinces of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up." You could see very similar in chapter 6. I won't read it right now, but very similar. The king sets up a decree, and this is with Daniel and the lion's den. The king sets up a decree. Verse 10, "Now Daniel knew that the writing was signed." He knew it was signed, and he went into his house, windows being shut and chambers, skipping down. He kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed. Both places you have a king saying, you can no longer serve your God. It's a short version of both these decrees. You're no longer allowed to serve your God. As I thought about it, we don't really know what that's like. I think we're getting closer to it with things like not allowing Bibles and prayer in public schools, and things like removing the 10 Commandments from public buildings, and just this is for free. I'll just throw this out there. If my kids were in public school, I'd still tell them to bring their Bible in to pray for their lunches, and if they got expelled, I'd be proud of my kid. That's free. That has nothing to do with the message, but just throwing that out there. But we don't fully understand the idea of a king saying, you can't serve your God. We don't have someone saying, if you pray, I'm going to burn you alive. That's what these men are facing. We aren't talking that they're going to get reprimanded if they pray, or they're going to get kicked out of some of this program, or even that they're going to get beaten. We're talking about they are going to get killed, and more than just killed, in a pretty terrible way. I don't think you can think of a much worse way to die than being burned alive or torn apart by lions. Those are terrible ways to die, but regardless of king's decrees, regardless of consequences, they still serve God. Their actions still point people to God. Their actions point people to God despite people knowing. They didn't do what we so often will do. We so often will serve God when we think that no one knows. Or we'll try to do right when those around us can't see it. Or at least someone that might make fun of us doesn't see it. Here's what I've learned, working with the teens and working with adults as well. Adults are no different than teenagers. They have the same insecurities and same issues. Their problems are just bigger. So I'll give an example of teenagers, and then you can apply it to yourself how you want to. They'll be in class, and they will participate every single week. They're involved in saying the memory verses and playing the games and whatever else we do that week. Every single week they're involved. And then one week, someone who they know happens in. And it doesn't matter if they invited that person or that person just walks in. That teen that every single week participates makes a transformation. Because suddenly, people outside of his church will know. And again, adults aren't a whole lot different. You have no idea, leading songs, how many times I see someone who sings congregationals every single service, but then someone they know sits by them from work and they just hold a book and stare straight ahead and give you that evil glare while you're trying to get them to sing. That's not what these men did. It's not what these men did. People knew what they were doing. People knew that they were praying and that they were serving God. That's how they set traps for him, because they knew that no matter what, they were just going to keep serving God. Because of it, their actions pointed people to Christ. Because of the way they lived, people saw Christ. And the same thing can be and should be true of us as well. It shouldn't be that people, that people can see Christ by what I do, not just what I say. That my actions point them or say as much about Christ as my words do. They showed people Christ through their words, through their actions, and lastly tonight, they showed people Christ through their faithfulness. They have 3 different ways I want to see this. Faithfulness through the fire. You think of with the fire, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these 3 men, as I said earlier, no one would have faulted them had they begged for mercy. Had they apologized and asked the king to give them another chance, people probably wouldn't have thought any less of them because they were the only 3 that had still served God. They're the only ones standing. So people wouldn't have thought any less had they said, you know what, king, play the music again. Give us another shot with this one. But they didn't change their stance when they found out the consequences. They didn't back down because they saw how hot the fire was. They didn't cower when they felt the heat. They stayed faithful through the fire. Then they stayed faithful in the den. Think about this. You're thrown in a lion's den. I don't care how big and tough of a guy you are. That's scary. I mean, that's going to be scary. A few years back, I watched a video of a guy at a zoo, and he was being a typical stupid guy at a zoo, hanging over the fence at the lion exhibit, seeing how far he could get, while his friends and family took pictures and videos of him hanging over the fence, Mr. Cool. And here's why I remember this, because he fell in. Yeah. And when he fell in, this big, tough, look at me man, hit the bottom and screamed like a schoolgirl, because he's now in the lion enclosure. And I could see Daniel doing that. I mean, I just got thrown in a den of hungry lions. But Daniel didn't panic. Daniel didn't try to crawl up the walls to get out. He didn't, find something to use as a weapon, a bone from the lion's last victim. He didn't try to find a weapon to hold the lions off as long as he could. I'm going to die, but I'm going to die fighting. He remained faithful while in the den. They remained faithful in the fire. They remained faithful in the den. And then lastly, they remained faithful. I'm going to word it this way. Remain faithful to the end. If you look at the very last verse in the book of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 13, I'm not going to wait for you to turn there. This is God talking to Daniel. It says, but go thou thy way till the end be. Verse goes on, and I'll stop right there. Go thou thy way till the end be. What is Daniel's way? We've already seen it. Daniel's way is serving God. That's what God's telling him. Just keep going. You look through the life of Daniel, and nowhere do you see him turn from God. You don't see a point in his life where he backs down on his convictions. Nowhere do you see where you see him take a weaker stand. Nowhere that you see him kind of back off. No, what you see instead is him remaining faithful through his entire life. And in every case of their faithfulness, whether it was the fire in the den or in the end, it turned lives to God. It was missions. All that they did turned people away from sin, away from the world, and to God. And their missions work, the way they did missions, ought to be true in us as well. Ought to be true in our lives as well, that we would win people through our words and through our actions and through our faithfulness. I'll simply bring it down to this, that every aspect of our lives would bring people to Christ. That it would all point to Him. So I was studying for this message. God hit me this way. Let it be known of me as it was of them that I was faithful in the fire, in the den, and to the end. That I was faithful in times of fire, the hardships and trials like they had, faithful in the den, in low times when it feels like you're alone, and until the end, until the day that I take my final breath, faithfully serving Him. I think of myself as a young preacher. I keep having people try to convince me that I'm not. None of the Sunquists are in here. Alex, this last week, tried to remind me that I'm not so young anymore. He and I were talking about something, and we're both running. And he told me, or I told him my time on a run, and he goes, "Oh, my first time I ran that distance was a little less than that." And I was pretty happy with the time. He was like, "Oh, my first time was 2 minutes less than that." And then his response was, "But don't feel bad. You're 12 years older than I am." Thank you. But I try to think of myself as, I may not be true anymore, I try to think of myself as young and as a young preacher, but I want it to be said, when I'm not a young preacher, he was faithful until the end. That the day I take my final breath, that they can say, he was faithfully serving God. And if that's true of us, then every aspect of our life will do like theirs did. It will point people to Christ. And through our life, we'll see, just like them, that those we encounter, those we cross paths with, turn to Christ. Let's pray.
With your heads bowed and your eyes closed, I'll invite you to stand tonight. You know, we talk a lot about witnessing in church, don't we? We talk an awful lot about the idea that we ought to be witnesses, and I heard it tonight how he said it in word, action, and faithfulness. We talk a lot about it, but I think sometimes that's about as far as it goes. We just talk about it. We all know we ought to be witnesses, and some of us that even say we want to be witnesses, we just aren't. I heard someone this week say he's a preacher. He just said, I'm just going to go through these points, and I'm going to ask you to ask yourself, yes or no. Just yes or no. Are you a witness in word, yes or no? You know, sometimes we talk about it. Just get real honest right there, yes or no. Are we a witness in our actions, yes or no? Are we a witness in our faithfulness? Yes or no? We talk about it. We all know we ought to be witnesses, but yes or no, are you? And you ask yourself these questions tonight, and then as the Spirit of God would lead, and we give this invitation tonight, we invite you to come, just kneel down and take care of things with God tonight. Yes or no? So we begin